Stalker 2 just got what is likely to be its biggest patch ever. Patch 1.1 came out yesterday and features over 1,800 fixes, including the first major changes to A-Life functionality in Stalker 2. This was an absolutely massive download at 115 gigabytes on GOG and 110 gigabytes on Steam. I wouldn't be shocked if some of you are still downloading this one, and unfortunately it wasn't even the only update to ship. Steam players also just got patch 1.1.1 to fix some additional issues that popped up after patch 1.1, and even earlier today, as I was filming this video, a third update has come out with patch 1.1.2. This dropped pretty much everywhere as an extra 10 gigabyte download, and yeah, all in, we got 3 updates in just 2 days. This patch touched on almost every major complaint surrounding Stalker 2, including some of the very first A-Life fixes. There was a whole host of technical fixes around A-Life, but honestly the patch notes almost don't matter here, and what is really different is the feel of Stalker 2, actually experiencing some of these changes. Previously, enemies would just kind of spawn a short distance away to populate certain areas. You could literally see the enemies spawning. Obviously that was unideal, but it was really just a band-aid fix until they finally got A-Life working, which came today. Because now with A-Life, enemies are going to spawn much further away and dynamically move around the map on routes, or sometimes even holding down certain locations for extended periods of time. And really, to just put it into a simple term, the NPCs you find in Stalker 2 are now moving around with a destination in mind. And in game, this is a massive change to the overall experience, to the point where it almost feels like a new game. Just playing and doing some typical exploration, I stumble upon and start fighting some mutants. Before this patch, this fight would be pretty simple. I'd kill the mutants and then basically just move on to the next location or objective. But now, all of a sudden, with A-Life, a group of ward soldiers was patrolling nearby and immediately jumps into the fight. Those soldiers didn't just spawn nearby, but in reality, this was on their route back to town, and their normal pathing just so happened to make it so they stumbled upon me fighting these mutants. The big change here being the offline transition. That's really what was fixed with this update. As I'm here next to this group, they're in the online mode of A-Life. This basically just being typical NPC behavior and simulation, what you could see in front of you. But conversely, as I run away from them doing some more exploration for a good 15 minutes or so, those NPCs did transition into the offline component of A-Life where their routes are just being simulated in the background without any interference from you, the player. So I go do some other stuff for 15 minutes or so, return to town, and lo and behold, I could find that exact same group of soldiers, their names are exactly the same, having just finished up their patrol and arriving in town right around the same time. So even though I couldn't see them walking, they were literally just walking this route southward, and that was all fully simulated by the game. At any point, I could have ran back and encountered them walking this way. This is the offline simulation part of A-Life, and that is now working. Those other NPCs will continue living even if you can't see them. And this means while you're exploring in Stalker 2, you now might find the results of a fight that you weren't even around for in the first place. You might just find a bunch of corpses and be able to loot them because, yeah, the simulation continued without you. But beyond that, you can now consistently find stalkers hanging out around campfires. And here, I had another really cool encounter with A-Life. I chatted with this lot, but then continued on to see a military patrol passing right by, likely headed to a nearby base. So initially, the stalkers that were at this campfire actually go into the building once they recognize these other NPCs coming by. It seems like they were basically taking cover inside of this house, but as these soldiers get closer and closer, eventually a full-on gunfight breaks out between the two groups. And in the end, the stalkers win and eventually return to that campfire, basically just holding down this location. And since the NPCs in Stalker 2 will now have drawn out paths with destinations in mind, you can even follow them and oftentimes find some really cool encounters. I stumble upon another group of stalkers fending off some mutants and decide I'll hang around these guys for a bit just to see what happens. It turns out they were headed to investigate this anomaly, but since no artifact was found there, they eventually turn around to begin heading somewhere else. Of course, I follow them, and yeah, they do move fairly slowly, so this did take a while, but eventually I do see another group of soldiers ahead, and this too is a pretty wild one, as what I see is not just a typical group of soldiers, but you'll be able to tell they're all injured. Every soldier seems to be limping here. So what this likely means is this other group got into combat at some point and likely won the encounter, but not without sustaining some injuries. So then this original group of stalkers I've been following notices the other group of soldiers, and another fight breaks out. But But due to those soldiers all being injured, the Stalkers easily pick them off and are able to move on. We then continue towards the closest town, and you could even run off, making pit stops at other areas, but then circle back around to find the same exact group of Stalkers still continuing on to their destination. That simulation is continuing even without you. But for all of that, I wasn't really doing much of anything. I was just kind of standing by, checking out A-Life in action without my involvement. But of course, this is a video game. You can be an active participant in all of these simulations. And this is where things can get really cool. So I loaded up a save game and instead start to take out a few of those patrolling Stalkers instead of just following them, to see how this would end up changing things. I take a few shots at them and then run off, but since their route is leading directly to me, even though they lose contact, eventually they pop up again and begin attacking me. The Stalkers continue to chase me, and I think this is A-Life kicking in as well. It definitely felt like the Stalkers were following me for a pretty long time, longer than they would have otherwise, so I imagine the range was increased thanks to A-Life, and this chase ended up going on for so long that eventually I ran into a second group of patrolling bandits, and suddenly I'm in a dire situation where I'm now taking fire from the aggroed Stalkers, but also these angry bandits, so I basically just run off to hide behind a hill just to see what would happen next. But things are still happening. I get closer again, and the second group of enemies now runs into a military patrol, so a third battle breaks out. At one point, they even blow each other up, so it's literally just down to 2 enemies in some one-on-one combat before the soldiers eventually come out victorious over the bandits. Although, of course, they took some serious casualties in the process. Honestly, I thought that was the end of it. I just kind of wanted to get this clip for this video, so I start running off to try and see where the other Stalkers are. But then, out of nowhere, a bloodsucker swoops in, finishes off that one remaining soldier, before aggroing against the original group of Stalkers that I aggroed, and then a whole additional fight breaks out between all of us. So rather than just reading some of the patch notes, I wanted to get in game and really show you some examples of A-Life in action, because it's moments like these, and all of that happened in just a couple of hours of gameplay, and there is this intangible, organic feeling to all of this. It's not like you're manually placing 2 groups of enemies on a collision course to fight each other, but instead, NPCs will just kind of have this natural flow around the world, and from time to time, one group or even several groups can all come into contact incidentally. And hopefully that provides a nice example of how this update really makes Stalker 2 feel like a completely new game, particularly by the mid-game, where things sort of turn into a bit of a running simulator, but A-Life makes those journeys so much more interesting and engaging because so much more will just randomly happen around you. Although unfortunately, it's definitely not all perfect, at least not yet. Obviously, this was only the first update to address A-Life in any way. More on the way, and GSC does confirm that. But before I started shooting some of these enemies, when I followed that group of Stalkers all the way back to town, I actually found something interesting. This random one-off NPC that was just running around. After walking behind these dudes for like 25 minutes, a running NPC to follow seemed like a very exciting prospect to me, and yeah, this guy was on a mission. Weaving in and out of obstacles, he eventually makes his way out of town on his own, and he was clearly determined to get to something, but then gets spooked and immediately just starts aiming into the distance out of nowhere. As far as I can tell, there was nothing there, and this NPC then just continues aiming while also backtracking back towards the town he just ran out of. He was actually doing this for a while, and I just kind of followed him. My concerns did grow over time though, so I tried talking to him in order to break this trance. But it turns out that wasn't the solution, as the NPC immediately turned the tables on me and then would only aim at me for a bit, which was rather odd. Before it seems like the A-Life, or really AI for this NPC overall, just kind of broke. The Stalker would just start wandering around in circles, sometimes not actually moving despite the walk animation playing, and just generally not making any progress in any given direction. Eventually I had to put him down for his own sake, but obviously A-Life 2.0 is currently not in perfect working condition. Even though the vast majority of my encounters were really enjoyable and interesting, I still did find stuff like this from time to time, and NPCs just kind of spawning is still a thing to some degree. It's definitely not as bad as it was previously, but in this example, I just go inside this building to look for some loot, and immediately after coming back out, there's a bunch of enemies around. I just had a long, extended fight in this area. I knew the area was clear, and obviously these NPCs just spawned the second I turned my back. One of the other common complaints right now with A-Life is over NPC draw distance. Stalker 2 doesn't have anything like binoculars, so you need to be relatively close to actually render other NPCs. Sometimes spotting the patrols can be fairly hard. Honestly, I was mostly relying on sound to find other NPCs, and yeah, after this update, if you hear some shooting in the distance, definitely go over to see what's going on, because a lot of the times you'll stumble upon something cool. And just overall, with A-Life finally turned on and active, the zone absolutely feels like a war zone now, and this does feel like it is the perfect time to jump into Stalker 2 if you are waiting. Stalker 2 is even 10% off right now on GOG, and if you pick up the game using my affiliate link down below, I'll even get a bit of a kickback. But like I mentioned a bit earlier in this video, A-Life fixes weren't the only thing included with this update, as we also got a fairly large optimization pass on the game. We get some more changes to dead zones and aiming with a controller. There was no addition of a dead zone option, but rather more tweaks to the aiming by GSC. Things are definitely better once again. It feels like this is another incremental improvement on aiming in this game, but messing around with the aiming with a controller for a bit, I still don't think it's quite perfect. Similar to A-Life, it feels like this is a big step in the right direction, but it's not quite final yet. Performance got some very interesting changes with this update. The patch notes describes several performance optimizations and calls out improved performance in populated areas specifically, but you also might not notice much more FPS. I mean, testing this myself, I didn't really have a major FPS boost, but that's not to say things aren't better. And after patch 1.1, Stalker 2 is definitely running a lot smoother. And checking some of the other comparison videos posted online with other hardware, this definitely seems to track. You'll notice that in patch 1.1, some of the huge stutters around encountering NPCs are just flat out gone from the game. And while your overall FPS is pretty similar, frame times and even your FPS lows should be notably higher now. And in this benchmark, you could even see that SSD reads go from 70 all the way down to 10, which is a giant improvement. So I really think two major things are going on here. Stalker 2 did get further optimizations, and you could definitely feel that in the overall smoothness of the game. But Stalker 2 also got more expensive to run. GSC made it clear in a past interview that many of the A-Life problems, and really the reason A-Life wasn't working, was because it was too costly on performance. They would turn on features and your FPS would just plummet. But now, with patch 1.1, it seems like they made several optimizations to the game to overall increase performance, but then also turned on A-Life, which is going to be more costly on your performance. So things are definitely running more smoothly, but at least for me, and based off many of the reports online, your overall FPS shouldn't be that much higher. Although, on the side of crashing, I noticed a dramatic improvement from this patch, or really all three of these patches. Personally, I was getting a ton of Stalker 2 crashes. Oftentimes, I'd see this exception access violation error, and it could get pretty bad. I was crashing 3 to 4 times in an hour at points, and honestly, filming some past videos was brutal as a result of this. Also, I had tons of crashes during shader compilation to the point where I downloaded a mod to just disable that, because otherwise it was making the game almost unplayable. But I can report, after spending quite a few hours in the game after patch 1.1 and now 1.1.2, I haven't crashed a single time. So it definitely seems like they made some major improvements around all of this, although make sure you are playing on the most updated version of the game. Upon release, patch 1.1 had its fair share of problems. Many were crashing during shader load or were flat out unable to load a save game without the game crashing. And that is the reason we got these two other quick release patches after the fact. Patch 1.1.1 dropped yesterday, and this was a Steam exclusive patch addressing some of the crashing problems. And then patch 1.1.2 came out earlier today. It brought some of those Steam fixes to all of the other platforms, but also included a couple of additional changes. Like now, Stalker 2 is going to automatically back up to 4 days of your previous saves. This is just going to be automatically on. You'll find a new folder with these backup saves, and it's really nice to just have this running in the background. Although patch 1.1 also brought a variety of balance changes and quality of life tweaks to Stalker 2. Your cause of death will now actually be shown on the death screen, which is pretty cool. There's some tweaks to the animation cancel timing for both consumables and reloads. I found that now you're able to cancel consumable timings a lot more quickly after applying the effects. So if you're using energy drinks a lot, you could start sprinting quite a bit sooner after drinking the drink. Stealth got a massive change with this update, to the point where it really feels like this was the update that enabled stealth gameplay in Stalker 2. You're now going to be far harder to detect while crouching in this game, and after testing this for quite a bit, it really is big. I feel like I was in the perfect situation for this one because just recently I was testing stealth quite extensively for a different video. I wanted to show off some of the secret features in Stalker 2, and get subscribed because that video still is coming, but after spending spending about 30 minutes trying to get some stealth footage, I literally couldn't get near these enemies. Every time I'd get even remotely close, the enemies would immediately spot me and start attacking. But what you could see is in the new updated gameplay from patch 1.1, things are totally different now. I'm able to actually approach and get very close to these enemies without being noticed and do some stealth takedowns on them. And basically what's going on here is enemies can still see you shockingly well if you're standing in the direct line of sight. They have night vision bionic eyes. But as a trade-off, now all of the enemies are basically deaf. So if you're behind an enemy, if they're not actively looking at you, they almost will never be able to detect you as long as you're crouching. So yeah, just make sure to approach enemies while their back is turned, and stealth will actually work now. A variety of other combat balance changes did come as well though. Gauss rifle damage was dramatically increased. Messing around with this on Stalker difficulty, I was able to one-shot just about everyone. This definitely makes the Gauss rifle a notably stronger weapon in game, and probably one of the best weapons in game. But you also got stronger, as an issue was fixed that caused helmets to not have psi or rad protection, so now many of those helmets you're already wearing will protect you even more. One of the best armors that you get right at the end of the game with the X7 suit is also now eligible for upgrades. Although if you're not cheating to get this one, it may be hard to utilize these because you literally get it right before the point of no return. Snorks got a nerf, and now their lunge will have a 30% longer cooldown. The arena fights had their balance adjusted to be more consistent throughout, so the difficulty level won't spike up and down as much. Several missions in Stalker 2 will now pay you out even more, and they removed the ability to trade with this hard-to-get vendor at the Noontide base. Honestly, not really sure why they removed that, but okay. And this update also, of course, contained a ton in the way of bug fixes. And included in that are many exploit fixes. Multiple infinite money glitches are now gone from Stalker 2, and they even addressed one of the issues with artifacts sometimes giving too much physical protection, but also exploits around unlimited carrying capacity and even unlimited stamina were all resolved and removed with this one. And a ton of fixes around quest progression, including a fix for that starting town quest that was plaguing many players. Overall, this truly is a massive update for Stalker 2, to the point where in some ways it really feels like a new game after this one. If you're holding off on picking up Stalker 2, 1 month later, I think we are finally at a point where I can easily recommend this game to everyone, and with the sale going on, there really hasn't been a better time to jump in.